Scene start. Visual, grainy black and white 16mm footage of a sterile hospital corridor. A solitary fluorescent light flickers overhead. The date stamp reads 1967. The sound of a slow, rhythmic ticking of a metronome echoes in the background. Narrator, VO. Cold, detached, analytical tone. Consider the human identity. Is it a biological imperative, etched into the very architecture of our chromosomes? Or is it merely a malleable construct, a blank slate waiting to be inscribed by the hands of authority? Pause 3 seconds. In the mid-20th century, the psychological establishment believed they had found the answer. They believed that nature was subordinate to nurture. That a human being could be broken down, reprogrammed, and rebuilt into whatever shape the social engineers desired. This wasn't merely a philosophical debate, it was the foundation for one of the most horrific, systematic psychological experiments ever conducted on a human subject. Visual, a clinical file folder drops onto a metal table. The name tab reads, Case File, Reimer, Bruce/Brenda. The file is stamped, classified/confidential, in red ink. Narrator, VO. This is the David Reimer case. Also known in medical literature simply as the John/Joan case. For decades, it was heralded as a triumph of modern psychological science. It was taught in medical schools, published in peer-reviewed journals, and used to justify the surgical and psychological alteration of countless children. But the literature was a fabrication. A meticulously constructed lie designed to protect the legacy of a single, deeply compromised researcher. Pause 2 seconds. Tonight, we open the classified files. We examine the timeline of trauma, the methodologies of coercion, and the devastating consequences of unchecked scientific arrogance. We will explore how a prominent psychologist used a grieving family as a laboratory, subjecting a child to decades of psychological torture under the guise of gender neutrality. Visual, the metronome stops abruptly. The screen cuts to black. Title card, The Blank Slate, The Anatomy of the Reimer Experiment. Scene 2, The Architect of Malice. Visual, archival photographs of the Johns Hopkins Hospital in the 1960s. Transition to a stark, clinical portrait of Dr. John Money. He appears authoritative, academic, untouchable. Narrator, VO. To understand the atrocity inflicted upon the Reimer family, we must first analyze the architect of the experiment, Dr. John Money. In the 1960s, Money was a towering figure in the emerging field of sexology and psychology at Johns Hopkins University. He was charismatic, dogmatic, and fiercely ambitious. Money was the primary proponent of the theory of gender neutrality. His hypothesis was absolute. He posited that human beings are born completely psychosexually neutral. According to Money, gender identity was not an innate, biological reality, but entirely a product of social conditioning and environmental rearing. In his view, if you took a biological male, surgically altered his anatomy, dressed him in feminine clothing, and relentlessly reinforced a female identity, that child would grow up to be psychologically, completely female. Pause 3 seconds. This was a radical, highly contested theory. To prove it, Money needed an ideal test subject. He needed a blank slate. But scientific ethics and basic morality prevented him from intentionally destroying a healthy child's life to test his hypothesis. He needed a tragedy. He needed an accident. Visual, slow pan across a mundane, suburban photograph of a young, working-class couple in the 1960s, Janet and Ron Reimer. They look exhausted but hopeful. Narrator, VO. The tragedy arrived in 1965, in Winnipeg, Canada. Janet and Ron Reimer, a young, working-class couple, welcomed healthy twin boys into the world, Bruce and Brian. They were identical twins, genetically indistinguishable. At 6 months old, both boys developed a mild, common medical condition, phimosis, a tightness of the foreskin that hindered urination. The prescribed treatment was a routine circumcision. Visual, medical diagram of a cauterizing needle. The visual is stark, medical, devoid of humanity. Narrator, VO. On April 27, 1966, Bruce Reimer was taken into the operating room. The physician, however, did not use a standard scalpel. In a catastrophic deviation from standard protocol, he utilized a rudimentary electrocautery needle. An electrical malfunction occurred. The device surged. The resulting severe burns completely destroyed the infant's anatomy. The damage was absolute and irreversible. Pause 3 seconds. The Reimer family was plunged into an unimaginable crisis. They had a healthy, identical twin brother, Brian, serving as a constant, agonizing reminder of what Bruce had lost. The medical establishment in Winnipeg offered no solutions. The parents were desperate, guilt-ridden, and highly vulnerable. Visual, a montage of old television sets showing news programs from the late 1960s. A television graphic displays the Johns Hopkins logo and the name, Dr. John Money. Narrator, VO. Months later, while watching a television broadcast, the Reimers saw a segment featuring Dr. John Money. He was confidently discussing his theories on gender reassignment and the plasticity of human identity. To the desperate parents, Money appeared as a savior. A man of science who held the answers to an impossible situation. They contacted Johns Hopkins. They surrendered their child to the institution. They did not realize they were handing him over to be the central subject in a psychological experiment. Scene 3, The Protocol of Erasure. Visual, a close-up of a typewriter striking paper, spelling out the words, Gender Reassignment Protocol, . Narrator, VO. When Dr. Money evaluated the Reimer twins, he realized he had stumbled upon the holy grail of psychological research. Identical twins. One biologically intact, the other surgically altered. It was the perfect control group. Money could subject Bruce to his gender neutrality protocol, while using Brian to measure the baseline development of a biological male with the exact same genetic code. Money's recommendation was swift and unequivocal: Bruce must be surgically castrated, given hormone treatments, and raised entirely as a female. The parents must never, under any circumstances, reveal the truth of his birth to him. The child's past must be systematically erased. Pause 3 seconds. Under the overwhelming authority of Dr. Money and the prestige of Johns Hopkins, the Reimers agreed. Bruce Reimer was dead. In his place, a new entity was constructed, Brenda Reimer. Visual, a sterile clinical observation room. A two-way mirror reflects the cold light. Shadowy figures can be seen observing from the other side. Narrator, VO. The psychological reprogramming began immediately. The Reimer household was transformed into a continuous behavioral laboratory. The parents were strictly instructed to enforce gendered stereotypes with ruthless consistency. Brenda was forced to wear dresses, play with dolls, and engage in feminine activities. Any display of masculine behavior was to be aggressively corrected. But Money's methodology extended far beyond simple parental instruction. The clinical visits to Johns Hopkins became a theater of psychological abuse, meticulously documented under the guise of therapeutic evaluation. Pause 3 seconds. Every year, the family made the pilgrimage to Baltimore. During these sessions, Money sought to violently enforce Brenda's new identity while simultaneously extracting data for his research. The methods utilized were deeply coercive, deeply inappropriate, and clinically traumatizing. Visual, redacted clinical notes flash on screen. The words "sexual rehearsal play" and "coercion" are highlighted in stark yellow. Narrator, VO. Money did not merely observe, he manipulated. He subjected the twins to intense, deeply uncomfortable interrogations regarding their anatomical differences and sexual functions. He forced Brenda to examine her own surgically altered anatomy, telling her it was completely normal for a female. But the psychological violations escalated. Money's theories heavily emphasized early childhood sexual rehearsal play. He believed that forcing the children to simulate adult sexual behaviors would solidify Brenda's female identity. According to later testimonies and unsealed records, Money subjected the prepubescent twins to deeply disturbing scenarios. He forced them to assume explicit positions. He documented their reactions. He created an environment of intense sexualization and psychological terror, rationalizing it as necessary clinical conditioning. Pause 4 seconds. This was not therapy. It was systematic psychological dismantling. The objective was to completely break the child's innate biological drives and replace them with the programmed identity Money required for his hypothesis. But biology is not a blank slate. And the human mind is not easily erased. Visual, a stark, contrasting image of two childhood toys, a broken plastic doll and a toy truck. The camera slowly zooms in on the broken doll. Narrator, VO. Despite the relentless conditioning, the dresses, the hormones, and the psychological warfare conducted by Dr. Money, the experiment began to fail almost immediately. The internal reality of the child violently rejected the external programming. Brenda did not behave like a stereotypical girl. She rejected dolls. She engaged in rough-and-tumble play. She fought with her brother. She urinated standing up. She ripped the dresses off her body in fits of rage. The parents, trapped in Dr. Money's protocol, were terrified. They reported these failures to Money, expecting guidance. Instead, they received aggressive reprimands. Money blamed the parents. He accused them of not enforcing the feminine identity strictly enough. He weaponized their guilt, telling them that if Brenda failed to adjust, it was their fault. Pause 3 seconds. The Reimer household collapsed into a state of perpetual psychological warfare. The mother, Janet, fell into severe depression, burdened by the immense, impossible lie she was forced to live. The father, Ron, turned to alcohol to cope with the suffocating guilt and the destruction of his family. Brian, the twin brother, grew up in the shadow of this immense, unspoken trauma, acting out in deeply destructive ways. The experiment was not just destroying Brenda, it was systematically annihilating the entire family. Visual, a publication cover from the 1970s. The title reads, Psychosexual Neutrality, a Case Study in Successful Gender Reassignment. Narrator, V.O. Yet, within the sterile halls of academia, Dr. John Money was constructing a completely different narrative. While the Reimer family was disintegrating, Money was publishing papers declaring the experiment an unmitigated success. He wrote that Brenda was a perfectly adjusted, happy young girl. He presented fabricated data at conferences. He omitted any mention of her extreme behavioral resistance, the family's psychological collapse, or his own coercive methods. He lied. Systematically, scientifically, and with devastating consequences. Pause 3 seconds. Because of Money's fabricated success, the protocol became the medical standard. Across the globe, infants born with ambiguous genitalia or those who suffered accidents like Bruce Reimer were routinely subjected to surgical and psychological reassignment based on the John/Joan case study. The lie had mutated into medical doctrine. And Brenda Reimer was trapped at the center of it, a prisoner of a false reality, rapidly approaching adolescence. Scene 4, The Rebellion and the Revelation. Visual, a sequence of unsettling, distorted images of a teenager looking into a mirror, the reflection constantly blurring and shifting out of focus. A low, droning synthetic bass note builds tension. Narrator, V.O. As Brenda entered her teenage years, the psychological dissonance became unsustainable. The biological reality of her genetics was declaring war against the medical and psychological interventions imposed upon her. Dr. Money's protocol required the administration of estrogen to induce female puberty. Brenda's body rejected it, physically and psychologically. She developed a deep, visceral hatred for the physical changes being forced upon her. Her gait was masculine. Her voice was deepening despite the hormones. Her shoulders broadened. She was relentlessly bullied at school, branded a freak, an outcast who belonged to neither world. Pause 3 seconds. Internally, Brenda was experiencing a profound, terrifying psychological isolation. She knew, with absolute certainty, that she was not a girl. But she possessed no language to articulate this reality, no context to understand why her body and her mind were in such violent opposition, and no allies to turn to. Her parents, terrified of Dr. Money's authority, continued to enforce the lie. The annual trips to Johns Hopkins escalated into overt psychological warfare. Brenda began to violently resist the sessions. She recognized Money not as a doctor, but as an interrogator. A manipulator who was extracting her trauma for his own purposes. She threatened suicide if she was forced to return to his clinic. Visual, a stark, white room. A solitary, empty chair sits in the center. The sound of a heavy door slamming shut. Narrator, V.O. By the age of 14, the experiment had reached a critical failure point. Brenda was profoundly suicidal. She was failing in school, isolated, and spiraling into severe depression. The facade could no longer be maintained. The Reimers, witnessing the imminent destruction of their child, finally broke Dr. Money's cardinal rule. They severed contact with Johns Hopkins. They took Brenda to a local psychiatrist, Dr. Harold Turnbull, and for the first time, they told the truth. Dr. Turnbull advised the parents that the only way to save their child's life was to dismantle the lie. Pause 4 seconds. On March 14, 1980, Ron Reimer took his 14-year-old child for a drive. In a tearful, agonizing confession, he explained the botched circumcision. He explained Dr. Money. He explained the fabricated identity. He told his child that he had been born a boy. Visual: the screen flashes blindingly white, then fades to a tight, focused shot of a pair of men's boots walking purposefully on gravel. Narrator: VO. The revelation did not destroy the child. It liberated him. Later, he would describe that moment not as a trauma, but as an awakening. Suddenly, the immense, terrifying dissonance that had defined his entire existence made sense. He was not crazy. He was not a freak. He was a biological male who had been subjected to an extreme, non-consensual psychological experiment. The rejection of the fabricated identity was immediate and absolute. Brenda Reimer ceased to exist. He chose a new name. A name that signified victory over a massive adversary. He named himself David. Scene V: the reclamation and the fallout. Visual: archival footage of medical textbooks being slammed shut. Rapid cuts of scientific journals with red lines drawn through the text. Narrator: VO. David Reimer's transition back to his biological gender was a monumental psychological and physical undertaking. He underwent a double mastectomy to remove the breasts forced upon him by estrogen. He began testosterone treatments. Over the course of several years, he underwent multiple, grueling surgeries to construct a male anatomy. He was reclaiming his body from the medical establishment that had stolen it. Pause 3 seconds. Meanwhile, the scientific community remained entirely ignorant of David's reclamation. Dr. John Money continued to publish papers on the John/Joan case, utilizing it as the definitive proof that gender was entirely a social construct. Money's career flourished. He was a celebrated pioneer, his theories unquestioned by the academic elite. It wasn't until the late 1990s, nearly 2 decades after David had reclaimed his male identity, that the truth finally breached the fortress of academia. Visual: a newspaper clipping emerges from the shadows. The headline reads, "The True Story of John/Joan." The name Dr. Milton Diamond is highlighted. Narrator: VO. Dr. Milton Diamond, a biologist and prominent critic of Money's theories, tracked down the Reimer family. He suspected that Money's claims were fabricated. When he discovered David living as a man, Diamond convinced him to go public. The paper systematically dismantled Money's claims, revealing that the successful experiment as a catastrophic failure and a horrific abuse of medical authority. The revelation sent shockwaves through the medical and psychological communities. The foundational case study that had justified the surgical alteration of thousands of infants was exposed as a lie. Dr. John Money was disgraced, though he never publicly apologized or admitted fault, maintaining to the end that the experiment failed only because the parents had not followed his protocol strictly enough. Pause 3 seconds. But the exposure of the truth did not erase the damage inflicted upon the Reimer family. The psychological scars of Dr. Money's experiment were deep, pervasive, and ultimately, fatal. Scene 6, the collateral damage. Visual: a slow pan across an abandoned, decaying family home. Dust motes dance in shafts of pale light. The sound of a hollow wind blows through broken windows. Narrator: VO. When examining the destruction wrought by Dr. John Money, it is easy to focus solely on David. But the experiment was a blast radius that annihilated the entire Reimer family. The lie that maintained Brenda's existence had fundamentally corrupted the foundation of the household. Let us turn our attention to the forgotten victim of this tragedy, Brian Reimer. Pause 3 seconds. As the identical twin, Brian was utilized by Dr. Money as the ultimate control subject. Every time David, then Brenda, was scrutinized, measured, and interrogated, Brian was there, serving as the biological baseline. He was forced to witness the terrifying psychological deterioration of his sibling while simultaneously enduring Money's invasive examinations. Brian grew up in a house built on secrets and profound guilt. He knew that his brother had been mutilated. He watched his parents slowly disintegrate under the weight of Dr. Money's authority. This chronic, inescapable trauma fundamentally fractured Brian's psyche. Visual, medical records flashing rapidly, words like schizophrenia, substance abuse, and overdose highlighted in glaring red. Narrator, VO. By his early 20s, Brian Reimer was completely unmoored. The psychological burden of the experiment, combined with the guilt of being the whole twin, drove him into severe mental illness. He developed schizophrenia. To quiet the deafening noise of his childhood trauma, he turned to heavy drug use. He was in and out of rehabilitation centers, unable to hold down a job, unable to maintain relationships, unable to escape the shadow of the Baltimore clinic. He felt responsible for David's suffering, a survivor's guilt so profound it became a terminal disease. On July 1, 2002, the experiment claimed its first life. Brian Reimer consumed a lethal overdose of antidepressants. He was 36 years old. Pause 4 seconds. The death of Brian was a fatal blow to the already fractured Reimer family. Janet and Ron Reimer, the parents who had sought help from Johns Hopkins only to be utilized as laboratory assistants in the destruction of their own children, could not survive the grief. Their marriage dissolved. The guilt of trusting Dr. Money, the guilt of enforcing the lie, the guilt of Brian's suicide, it was an unbearable, suffocating weight. Ron Reimer, the father who had finally told David the truth in that tearful car ride, spent his final years consumed by alcoholism, desperately trying to numb the reality of what had happened to his sons. Scene 7, The Inevitable End. Visual, a sequence of seemingly normal photographs of an adult David Reimer. He is smiling, standing with his wife and stepchildren. But the color slowly drains from the images until they are stark gray. Narrator, VO. Following the exposure of Dr. Money's fraud, David Reimer experienced a brief period of apparent stability. He married a woman named Jane. He became a devoted stepfather to her 3 children. He co-authored a book about his experiences, hoping to prevent any other child from suffering his fate. To the outside observer, it appeared to be a triumph of the human spirit. David had defeated the architect of his misery. He had reclaimed his identity. He had built a life. But the reality of psychological trauma is that it does not simply vanish upon the revelation of truth. The trauma is structural. The foundations of David's mind had been repeatedly detonated during his most formative years. Pause 3 seconds. The early 2000s brought a cascading series of catastrophic losses. He lost his beloved twin brother to suicide. His parents' marriage collapsed. He lost his job. He invested his money in a business venture that failed, leaving him financially ruined. And finally, the ultimate anchor of his adult life gave way. His marriage to Jane ended in separation. Visual, a slow zoom onto a closed, heavy oak door. The sound of a solitary gunshot rings out, abruptly cut off by total silence. Narrator, VO. David Reimer found himself entirely isolated, standing in the ruins of a life that had been sabotaged from the very beginning. The psychological resilience he had maintained for decades finally shattered. The darkness instilled by Dr. John Money in those sterile observation rooms in Baltimore finally consumed him. On May 4, 2004, in the early hours of the morning, David Reimer drove to a deserted grocery store parking lot. He took a sawed-off shotgun, placed it against his head, and pulled the trigger. He was 38 years old. Pause 5 seconds. Scene 8, The Legacy of Arrogance. Visual, a return to the stark, clinical portrait of Dr. John Money from the beginning. His eyes seem cold, calculating, devoid of empathy. Narrator, VO. Dr. John Money died in 2006, 2 years after David Reimer's suicide. He lived to be 84 years old. He died a wealthy man, surrounded by academic accolades, his legacy debated but his freedom never challenged. He never faced criminal charges for the psychological torture he inflicted upon the Reimer twins. He never lost his medical license. He never stood trial for the falsification of data that led to the mutilation of countless other children. And most chillingly, he never expressed a single ounce of remorse. When questioned about the failure of the John/Joan case, Money maintained a terrifying, sociopathic detachment. He blamed the parents. He blamed the local doctors. He blamed David's inherent psychological instability. He blamed everyone except his own unyielding, arrogant conviction that he could play God with human identity. Visual, the classified file folder from the beginning of the video is slowly closed. A red stamp slams down on it, Case Closed Fatalities, 2. Narrator, VO. The David Reimer case stands as one of the darkest chapters in modern medical history. It is a terrifying testament to what happens when scientific hubris overrides basic human ethics. When a theory becomes a dogma, and a child becomes nothing more than a variable in an equation. John Money believed he was proving the ultimate malleability of the human soul. Instead, he proved the exact opposite. He proved that identity is not a blank slate waiting to be written upon by the authorities. It is a biological anchor. And when you attempt to violently tear a human being away from that anchor, you do not recreate them. You destroy them. Pause 4 seconds. Visual, the screen cuts to black. The rhythmic ticking of the metronome returns, slow and heavy, fading out into complete silence. Scene end. Scene 9, The Architecture of a Lie: How the Establishment Failed. Visual, a vast, intimidating library of medical journals. The camera moves slowly down the aisles, highlighting rows of leather-bound books. The lighting is sterile and cold. Narrator, VO. To fully grasp the magnitude of the David Reimer tragedy, we must ask a critical question: how did the medical and scientific establishment allow this to happen? How did a single doctor, utilizing methods that bordered on psychological torture, manage to convince the entire world that a biological male had been successfully transformed into a female? The answer lies in the deeply flawed mechanics of peer review, ideological confirmation bias, and the terrifying power of academic authority. Pause 3 seconds. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Western world was undergoing a profound sociological shift. The second wave of feminism was challenging traditional gender roles. Sociologists and anthropologists were increasingly interested in the idea that gender was a social construct rather than a biological imperative. If gender was merely learned behavior, then the oppressive structures of society could be easily dismantled and reprogrammed. Dr. John Money's John/Joan case study arrived precisely at this cultural nexus. He provided the ultimate, supposedly empirical proof that the sociologists were right. Visual, archival footage of academic conferences in the 1970s. Men in suits standing at podiums, speaking with unearned confidence. Narrator, VO. Money's reports were not scrutinized, they were celebrated. They were exactly what the academic establishment wanted to hear. When Money published papers stating that Brenda Reimer was a perfectly adjusted, happy young girl who loved wearing dresses and playing with dolls, the psychiatric community swallowed the narrative whole. But behind the locked doors of Johns Hopkins, the empirical data was being systematically suppressed. Money did not publish the fact that Brenda violently rejected feminine clothing. He did not publish the notes where Brenda stated she wanted to be a mechanic or a garbage collector. He explicitly ignored the profound depression of the mother and the alcoholism of the father. He silenced the variables that contradicted his hypothesis, committing the ultimate sin of scientific inquiry. He altered the reality to fit the theory, rather than altering the theory to fit the reality. Pause 4 seconds. The peer review process, designed to catch fraudulent science, completely failed. Why? Because Money was considered an untouchable pioneer. Junior researchers were terrified to challenge him. Skeptics were ostracized. The medical establishment trusted the prestige of Johns Hopkins over the fundamental principles of evidence-based science. This failure resulted in a horrifying legacy. Because the John/Joan case was deemed a success, it became the gold standard for treating infants with ambiguous genitalia or those who suffered catastrophic injuries. For over 2 decades, thousands of children worldwide were subjected to irreversible surgical mutilation and psychological conditioning, all based on a lie crafted by a single narcissist. Scene X, the mechanics of coercion inside the observation room. Visual, a slow, creeping zoom into the two-way mirror of the observation room. The sound of a tape recorder clicking on, followed by the faint, eerie hiss of magnetic tape. Narrator, VO. We must now force ourselves to look closer at the specific methodologies of Dr. John Money. We must examine the psychological warfare conducted within his observation rooms, because to call it therapy is a grotesque distortion of language. The sessions at Johns Hopkins were not designed to help the Reimer family heal. They were designed to break them. Visual, a close-up of a typed transcript. The words are redacted with heavy black marker, leaving only isolated phrases. Forceful, resistance noted, inappropriate. Narrator, VO. Money utilized a technique that he termed sexual rehearsal play. He argued that children learn their gender roles by mimicking adult behaviors, and therefore, Brenda and Brian needed to be pushed into simulating sexual acts to enforce Brenda's female identity. The twins, prepubescent and deeply traumatized, were forced into horrifying scenarios. Money instructed them to inspect each other's genitals. He took explicit photographs of the children under the guise of medical documentation. He subjected them to intense, relentless questioning about their developing bodies and forced them into positions that were inherently abusive. Pause 3 seconds. When the children resisted, which they did, violently, Money did not interpret this as trauma. He interpreted it as insubordination against his protocol. Let us analyze the psychological leverage Money held over the parents. Janet and Ron Reimer were working-class people from a small town in Canada. They were facing an unprecedented medical catastrophe. Money was the polished, authoritative expert from one of the most prestigious hospitals in the world. When Money told them that any deviance from this protocol would result in the psychological destruction of their child, he weaponized their parental love. He created a hostage situation. Visual, a shadowy reenactment. A man standing over a cowering couple, pointing a finger aggressively. Narrator, VO. If you do not force her to wear the dress, Money would implicitly threaten, she will become a freak. She will commit suicide. And it will be your fault. This is the very definition of coercive control. Money isolated the family. He forbade them from seeking second opinions. He required complete submission to his authority. He transformed the parents from protectors into prison guards, forcing them to inflict psychological violence upon their own child daily. Pause 4 seconds. The trauma inflicted in those rooms wasn't merely the result of a misguided scientific theory. It was the result of profound sadism masked as academic rigor. Money required Brenda to be female not for Brenda's sake, but to stroke his own ego. The child was simply raw material for his legacy. Scene 11, the final diagnosis. Visual, a stark, black screen. A single white line appears, resembling a flatlining heart monitor. Narrator, VO. The David Reimer case is often categorized as a medical anomaly. A tragic mistake from a bygone era of psychology. But to dismiss it as such is to ignore the terrifying reality of what actually occurred. This was not a mistake. It was a deliberate, sustained campaign of psychological torture, authorized by the highest echelons of the medical establishment. Pause 3 seconds. Dr. John Money proved, through negative space, the very thing he sought to disprove. He proved that you cannot socially engineer the human soul. You cannot surgically excise an identity. Biology is not a suggestion, it is a fundamental architecture. When David Reimer, at 14 years old, ripped away the fabricated identity of Brenda, he did not do so because society taught him to be a boy. He did so because the relentless, undeniable truth of his own biology demanded to be recognized. David's life was an agonizing struggle against an invisible prison constructed by the medical elite. His eventual suicide, and the suicide of his brother Brian, were the final, tragic casualties of a war they never asked to fight. They were destroyed by a system that prioritized a theoretical hypothesis over human life. They were sacrificed on the altar of John Money's arrogance. Visual, the flatlining heart monitor line slowly fades to black. The rhythmic ticking of the metronome returns, slow, heavy, and final. Pause 5 seconds. Scene end. Scene 12, the whistleblower and the reckoning. Visual, a chaotic collage of newspaper headlines overlapping one another. The sound of camera shutters clicking rapidly. A spotlight illuminates a single document titled, Diamond/Sigmundson Report 1997. Narrator, VO. The eventual dismantling of Dr. John Money's empire did not happen overnight. It required a whistleblower of immense academic courage. It is crucial to understand the role of Dr. Milton Diamond, the biologist who finally drove a stake through the heart of the John/Joan myth. For decades, Diamond had been a lonely voice in the wilderness of gender science. He was a biologist who studied prenatal hormones and their effect on brain development. His research consistently indicated that gender identity was deeply wired into the brain long before birth. But because money's sociological theory was the reigning dogma, Diamond's biological research was frequently marginalized, dismissed, and ignored by the mainstream psychiatric community. Diamond knew that money's claims about Brenda Reimer defied all biological logic. But without access to the patient, he could prove nothing. Pause 3 seconds. The breakthrough came when Diamond teamed up with Dr. Keith Sigmundson, a psychiatrist who had briefly worked with the Reimer family in Canada. Together, they tracked David down. When Diamond finally interviewed David, the true horror of what money had concealed was laid bare. The publication of their 1997 paper, titled Sex Reassignment at Birth, Long-Term Review and Clinical Implications, was the equivalent of dropping a nuclear bomb on the psychiatric establishment. Visual, archival footage of Dr. Milton Diamond giving a lecture. He looks serious, methodical, determined. The lighting is bright and clear, a stark contrast to the shadows of Johns Hopkins. Narrator, V.O. Diamond and Sigmundson methodically eviscerated money's original case study. They exposed the relentless bullying Brenda endured, her complete rejection of the feminine role, the catastrophic failure of the surgical interventions, and the devastating psychological impact on the entire family. They did not just prove that money was wrong. They proved that he had actively engaged in scientific fraud. He had suppressed the negative outcomes to protect his career and his ideology. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Intersex activists, who had long suffered under protocols justified by the John/Joan case, used Diamond's paper to demand an immediate halt to non-consensual gender assignment surgeries on infants. The medical community was forced into a deeply uncomfortable reckoning. Doctors had to confront the reality that, following money's guidelines, they had inadvertently mutilated and traumatized thousands of children. Pause 4 seconds. Yet, the institutional defense mechanisms engaged. Many of money's acolytes, who had built their own careers on his theories, attempted to discredit Diamond. They argued that David's case was simply a failure of application, not a failure of the theory itself. They argued that the parents had not been strict enough, or that the local psychiatrists had interfered. It was a desperate, horrific attempt to protect a dying paradigm. They were willing to blame the victims one final time rather than admit that their entire ideological framework was built on the torture of a child. Scene 13, the epilogue of Dr. Frankenstein. Visual, a slow, dramatic zoom into a dark, empty operating theater. A single surgical spotlight shines down on an empty metal table. The ambient sound of a hospital fades into complete silence. Narrator, V.O. In the annals of Gothic literature, Dr. Victor Frankenstein destroys himself and his family in a hubristic attempt to conquer nature. He pieces together a creature from disparate parts, expecting it to obey his design, only to discover that life cannot be so easily commanded. Dr. John Money was the modern incarnation of that archetype. But unlike the fictional doctor, Money never realized his error. He never sought redemption. He remained cloistered in his academic fortress, arrogant and unyielding, until the very end. Pause 3 seconds. The tragedy of the Reimer twins is not merely a story about a botched medical procedure. It is a terrifying parable about the dangers of unchecked intellectual vanity. It is a stark warning about what happens when human beings are reduced to variables in an ideological experiment. We must remember David Reimer not just as a victim, but as an absolute refutation of an arrogant ideology. His life, agonizing and brief as it was, stands as a testament to the stubborn, unyielding reality of human nature. He proved that the core of our identity, the fundamental architecture of who we are, cannot be excised with a scalpel or erased with psychological conditioning. Visual. The camera slowly pans away from the empty operating table. The screen fades to black. A single, haunting piano note rings out and fades into silence. Narrator, VO. The files are now closed. But the echoes of the John/Joan case remain. They serve as a permanent, chilling reminder that science, when stripped of its humanity, does not illuminate the darkness. It creates it. Pause 5 seconds. Scene end. Image prompts for video production. 1. Image prompt 1, grainy, black and white 16mm style footage. A sterile, mid-century hospital corridor. Single flickering fluorescent light. Deep shadows. Creepy, clinical atmosphere. Cold and detached. 2. Image prompt 2, a top-down shot of a manila medical file folder resting on a cold steel table. The tab reads, Case File, Reimer, Bruce/Brenda. A stark red stamp across the folder says, Classified/Confidential. Dramatic lighting. 3. Image prompt 3, a stark, high-contrast, black and white portrait of Dr. John Money in the 1960s. He wears a suit and glasses. He looks authoritative, calculating, and cold. The lighting should make him look slightly sinister, like a villainous academic. 4. Image prompt 4, a medical illustration-style graphic showing a rudimentary 1960s electrocautery needle. The device looks crude, dangerous, and metallic. Stark white background with clinical blue accents. 5. Image prompt 5, an unsettling, dimly lit clinical observation room. A large two-way mirror dominates the wall. The reflection of cold fluorescent light is visible on the glass. Shadowy, anonymous figures can be barely made out standing behind the mirror, observing. 6. Image prompt 6, a split-screen or dual-focus image. On one side, a broken, plastic 1960s doll in a dress. On the other side, a rugged, slightly worn toy truck. Both items look abandoned. The lighting is melancholic and moody. 7. Image prompt 7, a 1970s academic journal cover. The title, Psychosexual Neutrality, a case study in successful gender reassignment, is prominently displayed. The cover looks clinical, official, and completely devoid of human emotion. 8. Image prompt 8, a distorted, unsettling view of a teenager looking into a bathroom mirror. The reflection is blurred, shifting, and indistinct, symbolizing profound identity crisis and psychological dissonance. Cool, sickly green and blue color palette. 9. Image prompt 9, a stark, empty white psychiatric evaluation room. A single, uncomfortable-looking chair sits in the dead center. The room feels oppressive, like an interrogation cell. Bright, unforgiving overhead light. 10. Image prompt 10, a tight, low-angle shot of a pair of heavy, worn men's work boots walking decisively on crushed gravel. The lighting suggests early dawn, symbolizing a new beginning and reclamation of identity. 11. Image prompt 11, a dilapidated, abandoned 1970s suburban home interior. Wallpaper is peeling, dust motes float in the air through broken windows. The atmosphere is heavy with forgotten trauma and decay. 12. Image prompt 12, a medical chart or clipboard in darkness, illuminated by a harsh spotlight. Words like schizophrenia and substance abuse are written in clinical handwriting, highlighted in a glowing, menacing red. 13. Image prompt 13, a collection of seemingly happy family photos, a man with a wife and kids, but the photos are arranged on a dark table and the color is visibly draining out of them, turning them into stark, depressing grayscale. 14. Image prompt 14, a slow zoom onto a heavy, closed oak door in a dark hallway. Light seeps only from underneath the crack. The image should evoke a sense of finality, dread, and isolation. 15. Image prompt 15, a tight close-up of a heavy red ink stamp slamming down on a medical file. The stamp reads, "Case closed, fatalities, 2." The background is pure black, focusing entirely on the brutal finality of the words.